So here, what you're going to see is we're taking the clips that we shot, and we're applying a mild color correction. Basically just using the eyedropper and placing it on the gray card and setting a custom white balance to what's actually in the frame after it's been captured by the camera, after it's gone through the lens, after we've corrected on the light. And it'll help you get a sense of how, when properly white balanced and any magenta or green shifts have been corrected out, any color temperature, warmth or cool factors have been removed. It just neutralizes the image and it gives you a sense of what you're actually left with after you give it, a basic correction. And it's important because some of these lights you're gonna watch some interesting things happen. Some of the lights that looked rather bad without any correction, even though it had a tendency to fall very warm or a little too cool or a little too magenta or a little too green, so long as it's balanced, those corrections can be taken out and they'll actually look quite nice. Things like the Westcott, the Dracast light, they correct rather well. Keep an eye on things like skin tone and the white in the shirt, and you'll see, even after the fact of a basic white balance, you'll see how the lack of the blue end of the spectrum still affects the image even after a proper white balance. That bit of warmth never really comes out of the image. You don't get that pure bone white feel from anything other than an HMI or even actually the plasma lights also were capable of that. Also, another thing you might want to, just to give you a sense of how accurate the light is, looking at the color temperature and the tint and seeing how much it actually changes between where it starts and where it ends to be quote-unquote accurate. The smaller that change, that's telling you that the light is producing an accurate color spectrum naturally, within the parameters of LED technology of the moment. Here's a good example. You could see how the KinoFlow Select 30, there isn't that drastic a change when it's manually white balanced, and it really gives you a sense that the light is doing its job correctly the first time. It's a very impressive unit. It looks quite good. And you can see, as you look through these, you'll notice that some of the units have very mild changes. Like, again, this the Matrix doesn't really require very much. And here's a great case, actually, of the Wasp Hive plasma. It changes it does actually jump quite a few degrees Kelvin warmer, but the fact that it has the blue in the light output itself, it has much more of the blue end of the spectrum. When you color corrected it, it actually matched the daylight pretty well. It had that white in the shirt, that bone white, that stark color that almost none of the other LEDs are able to reproduce. Now, something interesting that I've noticed in the tungsten world is that when you look at the spectrograph and you see how the tungsten unit has such a linear, smooth line from, very little blue to a whole bunch of red, nearly, and then I'm sure goes off into infrared pretty high. This is actually the one place where the LEDs match the spectrum a little bit closer. And this is why they appear to be able to match tungsten much better. The tone of the white of the shirts, the skin tones, the tones of the colors. It seems to mimic the tungsten spectral range a little bit more than it does daylight. And I think it seems as though LEDs are going to be way more useful in supplementing tungsten than necessarily supplementing daylight. Not saying it's impossible, but they seem to mimic tungsten better than they mimic daylight. As we get up into the middle range of LED units, you're going to start to see how the color matching and the, in general, kind of gets better and better, with a few exceptions here and there. But once they're, for all intents and purposes, graded, you're going to see that they start to get pretty good at matching the RE1K, especially the remote phosphorescent lights. They do a pretty spectacular job and would probably cut relatively seamlessly with very, very little additional correction. And you'll see here the global yellow cast kind of vanishes. And look at the white of the shirts. I mean, they just match up really well. The skin tones match up really well for all three. The Kinoflow, of course, does a great job, but once it's corrected, it really dials in. In a strange sense, the Kino almost looks better than tungsten. My DIT had a similar opinion. We both were somewhat laughing about it, saying that Kinoflow has done it. They've made a light that looks better than tungsten. This is a case where it's interesting, where the Very Green Junior from Mole Richardson corrected very well by adding magenta. But you'll see some of the lights that start with a heavy magenta bias that require green to be added. It doesn't seem to work that well going in that direction. It becomes difficult to maintain a skin tone. They come across as muddy. The Doppio under direct comparison, especially with the color correction, actually does quite well. I think it's one of the closer matches. And here you'll see the Cineo is one of those cases where adding green to counter a little bit of magenta, the shirt now suddenly took on a green tinge that wasn't there before, and is probably going to be very difficult to remove post-production wise. The Celeb 401 just matches perfectly. Tiny bit of green, but just the smallest amount. And with just a simple correction, the RE S60 really locks in. And actually, in my opinion, is more attractive in the end after a proper correction.